Hi Seals, happy Friday, welcome back, or happy whatever day you're listening to this video. We're on chapter 14 and it's called An Excellent Plot Twist. So Tilly and Oscar are in Anne of Green Gables and they've just gone to Anne's school and they're in Canada, of all the places. Okay, Tilly found it hard not to stare at Anne despite the hard wooden seats and smell of chalk in the air. There was still a dreamy quality to the whole affair. Anne was just like Tilly had always imagined her. She spent the morning mostly staring out of the classroom window, lost in her own daydreams. Tilly saw Gilbert trying to get Anne's attention several times, making silly faces and scratching his chalk so it made horrible screeches that annoyed everyone apart from his intended target. After failing to get her to notice him, Gilbert leaned across and pulled one of Anne's red plaits hard. "Carrots! Carrots!" Gilbert whispered, quiet enough to avoid the attention of the teacher, but loud enough for most of the students to hear him. Anne leaped up, fighting back angry tears, and grabbed the slate from her desk. "You mean, hateful boy!" she shouted. "How dare you!" And with that, she cracked it over Gilbert's head. Tilly heard Oscar yelp at the back of the room. The classroom erupted in shouts, gasps, and more tears from Tilly's deskmate, and they finally distracted Mr. Phillips from the sums he was writing on the board. "Anne Shirley, what is the meaning of this?" he shouted. Anne was still standing, staring at Gilbert with one half of her cracked slate in each hand. Gilbert spoke first. "It was my fault, Mr. Phillips. I teased her." But Mr. Phillips was having none of it. "I am sorry to see a pupil of mine displaying such a temper and such a horrible spirit," he said. "Oh, she hardly had a horrible spirit." Gilbert was teasing her, Tilly said, not able to help herself. Mr. Phillips turned to look at her, noticing her for the first time. Tilly felt herself shrink under his gaze. "I just mean, Gilbert was being rude, and I didn't mean to," she faltered. "Who exactly are you?" he said. "Are you a new student? Why wasn't I informed that you were to be staring? Why wasn't I informed that you were to be starting?" Mr. Phillips' scolding drew Anne's attention from Gilbert finally. "That is Tilly Pages, and she is my friend who is visiting, sir," Anne said. "Well, both of you will go and stand at the front and write lines for the entirety of the afternoon. I will not tolerate this sort of behaviour in my classroom. And you," he said, looking down his nose at Tilly, "have made a very weak first impression." Tilly exchanged a horrified look with Oscar. Whatever difficulties their school threw up, neither of them had ever been asked to write lines at the front of the class for a whole afternoon. Mr. Phillips walked in front of them to the blackboard and on one side wrote, "Anne Shirley has a very bad temper. Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper." And on the other side, "Tilly Pages has a quick tongue. Tilly Pages must learn to control her tongue." So in the olden days, they used to have to write lines like this. So that's the whiteboard there. Oh, there. Anne looked across at her mournfully. "I am so sorry for dragging you down into my shame. I just can't believe Gilbert would call me Carrots, and in front of everyone. Oh, and Mr. Phillips has spelled your name wrong as well to add insult to injury." "You'll have to use my extra E's," Tilly whispered. Oscar meanwhile slumped down in his chair and tried to avoid drawing any attention to himself at all. The endless lines made the afternoon a lot less enjoyable than the morning, and Tilly almost wished that she was in her usual classroom. When it was finally over, and Tilly, Oscar, Diana, and Anne left the schoolroom, they found Gilbert waiting for them, running his hand through his messy curls awkwardly. "I'm awfully sorry I made fun of your hair, Anne," he said, looking genuinely worried. "Honest, I am. Don't be mad for keeps now." But Anne simply tossed her head and pulled Diana and Tilly along with her, with Oscar awkwardly following. "Oh, how could you, Anne?" Diana said, scandalised, and tried to turn back to look at Gilbert before Anne tugged her onwards. "I shall never forgive Gilbert Blythe," said Anne, striding onwards. "Never." After the group had waved Diana off up the hill towards her house, Anne threw herself down onto a grassy verge by the path. "I am thoroughly embarrassed that you had to witness such a display," she said. "I work so hard to maintain my poise in trying situations, but it does not come very naturally to me." You shouldn't feel embarrassed at all, Tilly said. I thought you were wonderful. I wish I was brave enough to stand up for myself like you did. I think everyone else was very much on your side. And look how bad Gilbert felt afterwards. Don't even say his name to me, Tilly, Anne said, though her cheeks glowed with pleasure. I won't utter it from now onwards. What do you think, Oscar? About whether to ever say his name again? I feel like it might get a bit impractical, Oscar offered. No, do you think he felt terrible afterwards? Anne asked. I guess. Just as I thought, Anne said with a satisfied grin on her face. Their conversation was interrupted by a tapping sound coming up the path towards them. Tilly felt as though the air had been sucked from her lungs when she saw the man in the grey bowler hat come around the corner. She elbowed Oscar urgently in the side. That's Mr. Chalk, the man my grandparents were talking about, Anne. I don't know why he's here, she whispered. He was in the bookshop talking to Grandad, and he was at Alice's tea party too. He was talking to your Grandad, Oscar said, frowning. Yes, he was talking about a library. Well, he's heading our way, and he certainly has a very sour-looking face, doesn't he? Anne said, raising herself onto her elbows. Chalk neared where the three of them were now standing and doffed his hat at them, a thin smile on his face that didn't even nearly reach his eyes. That's the illustration we have in the book. Matilda, he said coldly. Out and about again, I see. Who are you? Tilly said, ignoring his question. Are you following me? My name is Mr. Chalk, the man said. I used to work with your grandfather a long while ago, and don't be so self-centered, child. I'm merely out for a wander, checking the board as it were. Just a happy coincidence to run into you, and with a friend as well, he said, nodding towards Oscar. Tilly didn't trust herself to say anything. Does Tilly's granddad know about all of this? Oscar said, gesturing vaguely around. Chalk made a noise like a giggle laced with a sneer. It was the worst sound Tilly had ever heard. Has your grandfather told you nothing? Chalk said. How interesting. An excellent plot twist, you might even say. He looked around as if wanting to applause. I wonder. But no, I'll let you get back home then, children. It sounds like you need to have a conversation with your grandfather. Perhaps we'll run into each other again sooner than we think. And with that, he tapped his way up the path. Tilly shivered, even though the sun was still warm and high above the trees. Can you take us home, please, Anne? She said quietly. Anne sighed as though their leaving was the saddest possible thing she could imagine, but held out her hands. Tilly and Oscar both took one, and the moment they were all linked. Tilly and Oscar both took one, and the moment they were all linked, the woods melted away as the familiar surroundings of Pages & Co. folded out and up around them. Just before the real world had settled and solidified, Anne smiled and let go and melted back into her story, leaving them standing in the bookshop. I think we need to talk to your granddad, Oscar said. They found him sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee and one of Jack's croissants. He smiled as they came over. Lovely to see you, Oscar. How are you getting on with that book? Grandad, Tilly said, and he looked up as he registered her tone. What's happened? He said urgently. Grandad, we need to ask you about something, Tilly said. We just got back from a book. Like, inside a book. Specifically, Anne of Green Gables. Together? You were both in Anne of Green Gables at the same time? That really is most unusual, Grandad said almost to himself. I think we're past unusual, Oscar said. Well, I suppose I knew this day was going to come eventually, Grandad said, taking a deep breath. I think it's time for you to meet the librarian. Ooh. So, Grandad and obviously Grandma know that they can go into books, even though Tilly found out for the first time. So that's interesting, isn't it? Okay, I hope you're enjoying the story. Speak to you soon. Have a lovely weekend. Bye.